Okay, today is April 12th. It's Monday. I wanted to get this video out. I had a little health issue on Friday, and so I'm going to do this video, and then I'm going to try and do the rest of the videos and have them ready before we go into Friday, so that you can watch them throughout the week and so you have access to them. And then I'm going to do a review on Friday. So you're still going to have all the videos, you're still going to have all the content, but I don't want to delay the exam, and I do want to make time for just exam review. And so throughout the next few days, I'm going to post all three of the lectures on the material that we're going to be covering. And then I'm going to have just a review. So you'll have those three videos available on YouTube, and then the last part will be on the day on Friday. We'll do exam review, and so we're going to have the entire 3 hours. So I might only post two videos, do one video, and then review in the afternoon for Friday. But I want to make sure we're on track with that. And then exam 3 and quiz 5 will be up, or quiz 6. So quiz 6 is a good prep for exam 3. And for most of you, right, that I have fewer people failing at this point, as people picked up their grade, but we do have a paper due. We do only have a couple weeks left in the semester, so make sure you're on top of it. Make sure you're in the right stage, so when we go into the final, you're ready for that exam, because you should see in the next couple weeks everything is fleshed out, the course is fleshed out. You should know the standards by now. So let's just talk about the perils of pluralism, and this is the Fernandez, the Taylor and Peevehouse and Scott Strauss article. And so we talked about elections, we talked about how they work, their structure. We didn't spend a lot of time discussing like presidential versus parliamentary, because this is a majors and non-majors, right? It has very clear distinctions. The majors, the political science majors, are going to need more information about this, so this is going to be something that you're going to continually refresh. Whereas the non-majors, it's something that you're not going to get enough out of, right? A presidential system, the big part of our presidential system that matters to us is that it's an independently elected office, right? That's what matters in this article. And so don't stress too much about presidential parliamentary systems, because in some cases, in some states, the parliament exists and the president exists. Like they elect a prime minister who's effectively the leader of the legislative branch and has an executive position, and then a president, which is just an executive position, which occurs in some cases. So we're not going to stress too much about that. Okay, so in this article, they talk about democratization and political violence. Now, democratization, right, we talked about being a democracy, we talked about an authoritarian regime, a democratic regime. One of the things that we have to consider is, how do you go from that process, and how do you go from one to the other, right? Specifically, we've talked about this before, how do you go authoritarian to democratic, because there is a lot of push by the great powers that exist to democratize other states. And so in the simplest of terms, right, this is just when you have incumbents and an opposition group that are allowed to compete, and that the election results are accepted by both parties. That's part of this democratization. So when we're talking about this, one of the things that can happen is when you don't have elections being accepted, or you don't have free and fair elections, or you have, right, in a competitive authoritarian sense, right, you have these sort of this uneven playing field that you have to worry about from the Levitsky and Way text, then what you will likely see is political violence in a lot of these cases, right? In about a little more than half of the cases in the data set, right, there was some election violence. And so political violence is just violence and violent acts that have political goals, right? And so this can be voter intimidation. If I threaten you, or if I assault you so you can't go and vote, or I target opposition supporters and I go break up their meetings, right? And then at the most extreme, civil war, right? Civil war is this political violence where each of the groups, right, that can be 2, it can be 5, right? All the groups split up and they try and seize control of the state or territory in the state, and that's how you get to a civil war. So we're not going to talk about violence too much. Violence and war and conflict, they really do fall more into international relations course. So let's talk about what this article is discussing, right? The data. And so they're looking at 1990 to 2008. And so this time frame is very important, because the first part about this that matters is, I'm trying to get you guys out of the light so you're not blinded. But the first part about this that is important to us is that this is post Cold War, right? That there's no Soviet assistance, there's no containment policy. So you don't have a lot of authoritarian regimes being propped up, right? You don't have this competition between the global powers that allows some of these states to grow in their autocracies. And it's before the global recession. So when you hit the global recession, you have austerity, and a lot of states have to face austerity, and it creates these problems where everyone's tightening their belt and you can't really provide rents. And so we're looking at a time period very similar to today, or today except for COVID, right? That we should see coming into 2021, 2022 as we move forward. This should be the standard. This 1990 to 2008 area time is going to be very appropriate to talk about then and now, right? Very similar times. We're talking about sub-Saharan Africa. So one of the things we don't have to worry about is comparison between states, right? When you're talking about Western Europe and you're talking about Africa, in the Western European case, right? If you're talking about Western Europe, you have very different levels of diversity, right? The Netherlands a little more diverse, right? France is not very diverse, right? It has some diversity, but very little ethnic diversity, very religious diversity, right? That Spain has the Inquisition, right? So they sort of remove a lot of the groups. In Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, what you do have is a lot of diversity, a lot of ethnic diversity, a lot of religious diversity, a lot of linguistic diversity in the states, and they are similar in that case, right? That you can compare them very easily because sub-Saharan Africa has a lot of this, right? They're almost all former colonies, right? So they have this history of colonization, right? They all have new governments, right? It wasn't until the end of the World War II, so they didn't really become states until the 1940s, 1950s. They didn't really become democratic or move towards democratization until about the 1990s. So we're looking at weak institutions that haven't been formalized and states with usually sort of not that developed economies, and they're all sort of ethnically diverse, right? So the cases themselves are very similar in sub-Saharan Africa, which lends itself to good research when you have similar cases that you're looking at. And it's good that they're similar because the focus is not on the differences in their demographics, about rents or, right, do they have natural resources? Do they, have some sort of cleavage that the other ones? No, they're similar. So the difference is when they have their elections, how they have their elections, and whether or not there's an incumbent. So it's a very clear focus on electoral violence, right? And what type of violence occurs before and after elections. So this article introduces this term clientelism, or what we often refer to, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, is often coined as neo-patrimonialism. And clientelism is sort of the universal term. You only really hear neo-patrimonialism when you're talking about sub-Saharan Africa. And this is sort of like you have these old patrimonial systems where you sort of have like the family unit and the village, and sort of you have this chief and he sort of distributes resources and loyalty to the chief. And then as the size and scale grows, right, you get this neo-patrimonialism, which is not patronage, right? Patronage is if you support me and I win, I'll give you a job, or you'll get some sort of benefit. And so that's an incentive system, right? That's an incentive system that exists in all states, right? All states have this where if I win, I'm going to give you things. Even if we look at, a clear democracy, the United States is clearly a democracy, even though it has some, clearly has some issues. But if you get your candidate elected, right, whether it's Biden, Trump, whatever, all the candidates we're going to see moving forward, one of the things is the reason why you get them elected is you expect them to pass policies and provide resources to the supporters, right? So Biden should be doing things that Democrats want, and whenever a Republican is in power, right, they should be doing things that Republicans want. So patronage is very normal, right? I got you elected, you should do things for me because you work for me, right? You're a representative of me. So that's not the same as clientelism. Clientelism sort of works backwards, where the leader says, I'm going to give you access to resources or rents or right? Something that you normally wouldn't have. But if I lose power, right, sort of the Mugabe line, or the line that is referenced in the text, right? If I fall, you fall, right? You do too, right? That so our fates are linked, and I'm going to provide you resources so that you continue to do things for me, right? And it's outside the realm of sort of the normal legal process, right? I want you to be violent. I want you to take in risky behavior, and I want you to use that violence to make sure I stay in power, because me being in power helps you gain access to these resources. So, right, clientelism is different in that sense, right? That I'm going to ask you to do things that are beyond the scope. Now, as we'll talk about, right, why can the incumbent say that and the clients agree to it, is because the clients know that they're not going to be prosecuted, right? The government's not going to go after them because it's the incumbent, even though he's not publicly asking them to do it, right? There is that part of it where the clients know they won't be prosecuted, but they also know that if, as they get in this relationship where they're doing violent acts for the incumbent and the incumbent is providing them with resources, that in the new system, right, if an opposition leader takes power, right, not only is the incumbent likely to face criminal charges or something worse, right, but the clients who have been doing these violent acts for the incumbent, right, they also could face prosecution with a new person in power. And so clientelism really becomes the structure for this argument, right? They are tied in their fates in such a way that they'd be willing to become violent to keep from losing power because of all the consequences when they lose power, right? And we've talked about this. Libya is the most obvious example, right? Gaddafi was in charge for a very long time of Libya. He had a lot of power and a lot of clients, but when he lost power and he lost that support, he did not have the support of the public, and it took so much to get him out that when he was finally sort of caught in the street, he was murdered, right? That he was killed by his citizens in the street. So, right, that sort of encapsulates how high the stakes are, right? If when you lose power, you could lose all of your money and all of your wealth and your life. And so when the stakes are high, you're willing to do a lot to stay in power, right? That risks the risks of the behavior of violent behavior to stay in power seem more justified because of that argument that what happens when I lose power. So any time that we're saying that there's this new aspect that is the reason why things are happening, right? Incumbents running for election is their argument. And so we have to discuss alternative explanations. And these are explanations in the literature. So some of these will tie into the argument made in the article, but we'll see why they're not quite as effective as the argument made by the authors, or why the authors say that their argument is better. The first is that incumbents will use violence, right? We expect them to use violence when they perceive that the opposition is very popular and when institutional constraints are minimal. So I've read through some of your work, right, and it's sort of like, oh, well, the legislative branch, does it really matter if they're passing laws or they're putting limits or checks, right? If the executive can do whatever it wants, right? Well, that's the whole point, right? Can the legislative branch, can the judicial branch stop the executive from taking advantage of their position and providing resources to clients, right? Can they just say, oh, I have this rent, I'm going to give 10% of it to a client, or does it have to go through a legislative body and an appropriations committee? And right, what institutional constraints are there to stop that executive from just doing whatever they want? And the other part is perception it doesn't always align with reality, right? So it might seem like an opposition leader is very, very popular and could win an election, but we don't know. And that uncertainty causes problems for incumbents where they're like, oh, I'm not sure I'm going to win. I'm going to resort to violence maybe too early on. And I might have won the election either way, but I turned to violence because I wasn't sure. And I want to be sure that I'm going to win this election. We do know that when an international observer, right, when you have sort of these international organizations and when you have other powers come in and observe an election, what they will come up with sometime is that there was fraud, in these elections. So when international observers say there's fraud, it increases the likelihood that the people who feel they were defrauded or they didn't get the outcome they wanted because of fraud, right, they're more likely to become violent. And so this has happened historically, right, in many, many states. And in sub-Saharan Africa, it happened, I want to say 7 times in the data set, right? And in all of those cases, international observers said, okay, there is something fraudulent in this election, right? The group that lost because of that fraudulence, right, they resorted to political violence. And by political violence, remember, I'm not trying to sort of sugarcoat this, right? This is where they become violent and people die because of their violence, right? This is not some American sort of politicized terminology, right? Political violence is violence, physical violence against individuals because they don't accept the election outcome, right? And so you want to make sure that we're looking at this in very clear terms. Another alternative explanation is this majoritarian electoral systems. So if you have a winner take all, right, if one person's going to win, and in a presidential system, there's one winner, right? So everyone else loses. So because the stakes are so high, because you know that if you lose power, you could face, you know, ruin or economic ruin or be murdered or any of those things, right? You're much more willing to commit violence if it's winner take all, because it's not up in a parliamentary system. You might still share power with the opposition party that comes in, but with a presidential system and a majoritarian electoral system, you're either in or you're out. You either have all the power, you have none of the power for that office, and so that increases the likelihood that you're willing to become violent. And then competitive elections in illiberal systems, right? This ties into the first explanation, right? If you have a lot to lose and you're not sure, and it looks like you can lose because it's a competitive election and there aren't any institutions to stop you, then why not ask your elites and ask your clients to become violent to help you win an election? So their hypothesis, right? It's pretty clear, right? They want to look at individual incumbents. So these are people, right? These are people like Mugabe and Moi, who were elected, who held an executive position as president, and who then are running for re-election. And so they're saying, because of all these theoretical arguments we talked about, the expectation is that you will have more violence before an election, as it turns out, when an incumbent is running for re-election, because they've developed this personal network. They developed this personal network where all these clients, right, are getting their commercial advantages. They're getting their rents from, right, they're getting the revenue sources from rents that are given to them by the incumbent. And so it's not the incumbent or the government that's becoming violent. It is the clients who hire thugs or youth organizations or whatever the terminology may be for that case. And those clients engage in violent behavior. They take risks. Now, it's risky because you don't want to get caught, you don't want to be associated, right? You don't want that link getting back to the incumbent, but it's not a fear of prosecution, it's a fear of what happens when there's more violence. The only thing that really ties into the alternative explanations we already discussed is there has to be a fear that the incumbent will lose, right? And there has to be a belief that the incumbent cannot secure re-election through nonviolent means. Now, we see in a lot of cases where the political violence may have occurred, electoral violence might be something that could occur, but instead what happens is the individual can use vote buying and patronage and co-option, right? If you have someone who looks like they're going to gain power through opposition, but you know you can just offer them a bribe and they'll become part of your party, then a bribe's easier than risky in political violence, right? The risk versus reward is just higher to use nonviolent means, or you just buy the votes, right? You say, okay, well, you know, this small ethnic group is really a big key supporter of my position. So I say, okay, if you switch over to my party, you know, I'm going to make sure that your elites in your group has certain access to rents, right? And so why not? You have to not be able to do it through nonviolent means, because if you could do it through nonviolent means, that would be the option that elites, that incumbents choose, just because it's less risky and less costly, right? Violence is costly. So they give us 3 like really brief case studies, and so they're talking about Sub-Saharan Africa, right? Equatorial Guinea is led by Mba Sogo, right? And in 6 elections, in all 6 elections, you have violence. Well, we should expect violence in this case in Equatorial Guinea because a lot of their economy, or a portion of their economy, is through oil rents, right, and resource rents, which we talked about, right? The right Geddes piece, right? That when you have oil, you can essentially tie yourselves to the success of the elites by saying, okay, you are in control of this territory, this section of the state. I have oil. I'm getting rents from foreign corporations, and so I'm going to give you 5, 10%, whatever the number is, so that you can run your operations, and then you support me, the incumbent. And so Mbasogo does this very effectively. But when you're relying on elites and rent to maintain power, what you don't have is the support of the public. And so that creates a role for the opposition groups to come together and say the public's not being supported, the large masses are being supported. And so when you have elections and you know you're going to lose because your rents are pulling you away from being responsive to the public, right? Then you resort to violence and you ask those elites that are getting rents, that are getting some revenue from the rents that you have, to act and hire youth groups and break up opposition group meetings. The next is Zimbabwe. Mugabe was in power. I don't know if he's in power now, but he was in power for a very long time. And you see that you have a similar behavior as Mbasogo, but they don't have oil rents. What they have is commercial land or agricultural plots, right? All land is commercial, essentially. But these land plots are owned by white farmers, and until about 1970, Zimbabwe is white ruled. And so when Mugabe comes to power, when you have this power transition, instead of gaining popular support, one of the ways that Mugabe's party gets support from the public is they encourage groups to go and seize white-owned land and not not compensate those individuals for the land that they're taking, and reallocate that land to the black population, right? Now, I'm not trying to, this isn't really a racial issue, right? Zimbabwe is very, very different than the United States. So the point here is not the racial component. The point here is that instead of an electoral, instead of a policy-driven election, the supporters of the Mugabe party, of that incumbent, right, of the president, they got a lot of their benefits through the seizure of land, through the reallocation of land. And so it still fits this, I'm an incumbent, when I run for re-election, you need to support me, or you may not have that land, right? It's that clientelistic aspect that really matters in Zimbabwe. And then we have Kenya, and what's really important about Kenya is we start with Moi, and in 3 of the elections, he's the incumbent, he's running, or 2 of the elections, he's the incumbent and he's running, and you have this political violence. And then there's a shift when Moi no longer is going to be running, and you have 2 new candidates, right? You don't have an incumbent running. And what you see is whenever there's, in Kenya, when there's not an incumbent running for your re-election, you don't have the political violence. But when you do have an incumbent running, you have this political violence. And so that's our best, clearest case is Kenya, because it makes this point clear that, yes, clientelistic arguments are moving forward. That theoretical argument is supported by Equatorial Guinea and Zimbabwe. But in Kenya, we get a really clear sort of supporting case where it says, look, we've shown that this argument, we've shown it's tied to clientelism. But what is proven here is that when there's an incumbent running, you have political violence. And when an incumbent's not running, you don't have political violence. So incumbent re-election is really this factor that matters. So the next part is, don't worry about SCAD, NELDA, AEVD. So they use the data set AEVD, but SCAD and UCPD PRIO, and many of these other data sets, they all have different metrics for violence, election violence, what it means to be a democracy. There are a lot of data sets. I don't expect you to know the names of data sets or to know them, right? We talked about Freedom House and Polity 4. But that was informative, right? I wanted you to know the difference between Polity 4 and Freedom House because it was informative. I don't expect you to remember Freedom House and Polity 4, right? Just the differences of how we measure democracies, and understanding that different measurements are used for different purposes. So along those lines, one of the things that the AAVD, the data set that they're going to be using, is that they code on 3 different dimensions, right? First, they look at, is it the incumbent and the incumbent's elites that are doing the violence? Is it the opposition violence, or is it both, right? And so that's important to know. One of the things we should expect is that the incumbent should be the violent actor, right? And the incumbent and the incumbent's elite should be the violent actors. They should be hiring youth groups, and right, they should be using violence to oppress and repress the opposition groups. So we should see the incumbent be more active than the opposition. Also, we have to look at before or after the election. Now, something we talk about a lot that is in the article, but I think it's a longer debate that we're going to continue to have, so I'm not going to worry about it in this exam period, right? That's the big part, is I don't want to add it to this exam. We're going to talk about an identity and parties in the next exam. But one of the things that we will see is that before an election, we might see more violence because those people running for re-election, they might exacerbate or highlight racial divides, ethnic divides, right? They might say, those people, this othering, right? Those are outsiders, they're different, they're ruining the country, right? All this language you see ramp up before an election, right? If you look 3 to 6 months before an election, you'll start to see racial and ethnic cleavages increase. But then after election, you'll actually see racial and ethnic cleavages decrease. Well, why does that happen? Is because before an election, you start seeing voter intimidation, vote buying, and mobilization of voters. And one of the easiest ways to mobilize any voting group is to say that there's another group, right? The opposition is in favor of, right, this other group that's going to ruin it for you, right? That if you're Malawi in Uganda, right, that there's another group that's going to ruin your life. No, Malawi are in Uganda. I apologize. That's not accurate. But if you're one group, right, the United States is the most obvious example, but it's very there's a lot of racial and immigration components there. But essentially, right, you say we're the majority, there's this minority group or this other group, right, and they're ruining it for us. And if you elect that other person, that other minority group is going to take power. And that sort of fear-mongering, to use a very stigmatized word, right, is part of the election cycle. And it occurs in almost all election cycles, right? The candidates know they can mobilize their voters by making it seem like there's another group waiting to take their power away. And so you have to look at before the election and after the election and treat them separately, because before, it's about mobilization and intimidation and trying to either make your voters, mobilize your voters by saying that if you don't stay in power, things are going to get really bad for them, or, right, intimidating the opposition voters. But after an election, the biggest source of violence is whether or not some sort of foreign observer or the groups involved think that the election was free and fair, right? This is one of the few times in history that I can use the American example, right? That the majority of the people that were at the January 6th insurrection makes it seem like they are organized. I don't know how organized they were, fairly organized, but, right, these people used political violence, right? They came and right, that there were deaths and assaults in the Capitol building on January 6th. And one of the reasons they point at is because they believe that there was fraud in the election. Now, there's no evidence of fraud, right? That why some people believe that, there's no evidence of fraud in the election, right? Or widespread fraud, right? You always have a few voter fraud issues, right? Individuals who voted by mail and then voted in person, or, right, who voted in the wrong county, right? Is that fraud? Do they mean to vote in the wrong county, or is that just error? You always have that, but it's never enough to change the outcome of election, right? That the election security is very high in the United States. So fraud claims usually drive this, and you can see how, if you think you've been through an election and it was fraudulent, right, that the people who feel like they were disserviced, they are willing to commit political violence to try and change the outcome. I'm not justifying it morally. I'm just explaining, right, why we see this. And we see this, it's very rare in Western states, but it's fairly common in Sub-Saharan Africa. And we'll talk about that when we get to the results and analysis. And then the last part, right, is the level of violence, right? We want to look at in some cases, we want to look at when there's no violence and when there is violence, right? Just dichotomous, binary, right? Is there or is there not violence? But then sometimes we want to really differentiate between, okay, was there violent harassment where people were assaulted, and trying to, like, if they thought they were voting for the wrong person or trying to intimidate them? Was there repression, right? Did the government actively go out and break up opposition groups and arrest and kill opposition leaders? And then generalized violence. And generalized violence usually is just civil war. Is there an outbreak of violence on the streets? And so sometimes we want to look at this and see, okay, how much did this escalate? But we also might want to look at just violence or no violence. And so this data set allows us to do both. All right, so we took at 221 cases. So these are years in a state that had an election, right? So Zimbabwe, 2008, that's one case, right? And so you had 221 election cases. Of those 221, 129, so more than half, right? The majority of election cases had some violence, and 122 of those cases were pre-election violence. So this is important. The overwhelming majority, right, 122 out of 129 happened as pre-election violence, which really supports this incumbent tied to the elites, right, this clientelistic nature of the aspect, right, because the violence occurs before the election to make sure the incumbent stays in power. You did have some initial multi-party violence in 1992, 1993. This is when the sub-Saharan African states start to move into multi-party elections, so the move towards democratization. But in 2000 and 2005, there were actually higher levels of violence than in the initial period. So this isn't like democracy just gets better over time, right? Lindbergh said, like, oh, as you have more and more elections, it becomes the only pathway, it becomes the easiest aspect. Well, that's not really holding up in this data set because you still have elections, right? You still have elections that are becoming violent and have political violence. So we do see that, right, it's not just something that gets better over time, or it was worse and it sort of, the trend line is down, there's less violence over time, right? It can go up and down, there's other factors at play. Most of it's occurring before the election, so it's out of fear that the incumbent will lose, that they become violent. And then the incumbents were violent 98% of the 129 cases. So in almost all of the cases in which there was election violence, it was the incumbent and the incumbent's elites who was committing the violence. Now, in 80% of the pre-election cases, the opposition group was also violent, and in 74% of the post-election cases, the opposition group was also violent, right? So there were very few cases where the opposition was violent and the incumbent was not. So this is very clearly incumbent-led, right? It's the incumbent's party and the incumbent's elites that is leading the violence. It's occurring before the election, right? And it's not getting better over time. So we can point to this and say, yes, it is tied to this clientelistic network. It is not tied to other factors because it's occurring in the way we predicted through incumbent re-election tied to political violence. So we have some statistical models. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Right, the independent variable is the incumbent running for re-election. The dependent variables is election violence, whether it's pre or post-election, and then some control variables, right? So the control variables really help us see if the alternative explanations make more sense than the theory that we're suggesting, the hypothesis that we're suggesting. So I always want to include GDP per capita, right? There's a lot of literature that says, well, if you have more wealth or if you have more income, right, then you're less likely to commit violence, right? There's some arguments about if you have a good job, you're not willing to risk it by becoming violent, but if you're very poor and you think, right, this is what we call equality, opportunity costs, right? How much does it cost you to become violent, right? If you have a really bad job and your economic situation is really bad, then committing a crime isn't as risky because what do you have to lose? But if you have a full-time job with benefits and a family and all of that, then you're less likely to become violent because opportunity is really high. You lose a lot if you get caught committing a crime. And then regime type, right? Do we expect democracies or authoritarian regimes to have more of this political violence? Recent regime change, if you just went through a regime change, right, as we looked at in the last one, right, that this is Lindbergh's argument, right, you should see more violence. And then these are all things that we expect to have an impact, so we want to include them as control variables. Path to power, if you're in Egypt and you're El Sisi and you came to power through violence, right? That violence is how you took power from the Muslim Brotherhood, so that no longer is a democracy, and now you're taking over as authoritarian leader. Then when you run for election in the next cycle that El Sisi runs for re-election, if he does run, right, you should expect him to be violent because he was violent in the first place, right? The best predictor of future behavior is relevant past behavior. So El Sisi you should expect a continued militaristic approach from a general, right? That those are normal ways. Whereas if you have someone who's elected to office or put into office through some special election or appointed into their office, right, that you should expect that pattern to continue. So path to power really matters. And then ongoing or recently ended civil war. If they're in the middle of a civil war, of course there's pre-election violence, right? And so it's harder to tell, did it intensify, did it decrease, right? Is this election violence or is this civil war violence? How do we split those up? If you have a election right after a civil war, there are actually two different thought processes for this. The first one is that you already have the military and the weapons and the militias, right? You already organized a fight. If you're just coming back from a civil war, the two groups are already organized to fight. So they might be more likely to become violent before and after elections because they're ready for it. Now that increases the likelihood of violence. The problem with this specific aspect is because there is another literature that is very robust that talks about war exhaustion, or right, that at some point, right, both groups are to say, is this war worth it? Is this civil war worth it? Is this worth the cost? And we've seen this in the case of Lebanon, right? We've seen this in a number of other cases, right? And in Lebanon, one of the big things that helped lead to a civil war wasn't that they resolved the differences. It was that they had lost so many lives and so many costs, right, that people had lost, that they were willing to come together to find some sort of solution that would help them in their civil war. So that when into the next election cycle, they were much less likely to become violent because they had just spent so much time and were so exhausted and so unwilling to commit violence again, right? That they were done with that process. And there were a few years where even when things weren't working very effectively, they didn't want to resort to violence because they were just tired of violence in general. And so those are contradictory explanations, and it really just depends on the specific case, right? If you've been in a civil war for 20 years, then you're going to have exhaustion. You're not going to want to sometimes what we call fatigue, right? That you're not going to want to fight anymore because you've been fighting for 20 years. Let's just not fight. Let's figure out something else, right? Whereas if it's a short civil war, 6 months to a year, then that would increase the political violence if you still have the weapons and the militias because you're ready to fight already, so it takes less of an effort to go into a conflict, which means that opportunity cost is lower, right? It's easier to get into a conflict, and therefore it's more likely to occur. So we do have some clear results in analysis. Statistical significance is something that all of you will have to learn to get a bachelor's, but what's important here is that the incumbent running is important. It's relevant in all the models. When I say statistically significant, that means that it has an impact on election violence whenever he's running for re-election. Whenever an incumbent runs for re-election, it's going to have an impact on election violence in sub-Saharan Africa. We also see, right, that now it's supported by the theory and the analysis, and right, the case studies say, okay, we should expect this. We've seen this in these cases as real-world examples. And the regression analysis says, look, even when you account for other variables, control variables, this remains significant. This remains impactful. And so in the models and the quantitative data, right, what we see is that the incumbent running becomes very important, but these alternative explanations, they're not significant. They don't retain their impact. And so this really becomes the best argument according to the authors, because when you look at the modeling, the quantitative data, the only thing that remains significant is whether or not the incumbent is running for re-election. So you're getting a lot of support from the data and the cases for this argument being made. So let's just conclude with this. The first part is, yes, the incumbent running has an impact on especially when it's the president, right? When it was a presidential election, the incumbent running has more support than other explanations, right? That when the incumbent runs for re-election, you're more likely to see um, you're more likely to see violence, election violence, and it's more likely to be pre-election violence to maintain that incumbent in power. Clients are reliant, right? They do rely on the incumbent for access to resources. So one of the ways we can look at this is, yes, it's the incumbent running for re-election, but chronologically before that, the reason why the clients become violent is because they, right, before, as you're getting closer to election, they become violent because they're saying, if we lose this election, I lose my position in society, I lose my resources, I lose my ability to have, right, these certain aspects in our society. And so I'm willing to become violent in order to stay in the position I'm in, right? And then, as we discussed, right, pre-vote mechanisms and post-vote mechanisms are very, very different, right? Pre-vote violence is just, I want to keep the incumbent in power, whereas post-vote violence is, I don't accept these results. Now, it's important, before we conclude, right, in each of these cases, perception matters, right? Perception matters because it doesn't have to be in line with reality, right? When we're talking about an incumbent fearing they're going to lose, that doesn't mean that the polling even suggests that they're going to lose, right? They might be ahead 6 points, but they're like, well, there's a chance I might lose, so I have to go out and really repress the opposition group because I don't even want there to be a chance that I'm going to lose, right? Or they perceive it incorrectly. They're like, oh, I keep talking to people who support the opposition. I feel like that's all of them, right? And that's called anecdotal evidence. So if you talk to people and you say, oh, I was talking to a few people and they really hate someone, right? Right? Gavin Newsom is up for a recall, right? Right now in California, and Republicans are like, oh, everyone I talk to hates him. Well, he's a Democratic governor. If you only talk to Republicans, that's anecdotal evidence because you're not really getting the full picture. So perception is one of those things where you can get it reinforced by your environment because your environment intentionally sort of sets up that position. If you're a Republican, your friends and family are probably Republican, and therefore when you're looking at, okay, how much is this person supported? We're like, well, there's no support for this person because everyone I talk to, but you're in that self-selection bubble where you're not getting a full picture. And then when it comes to accepting results, right, that one of the things we've seen in the past 30 years in a number of states, not just the United States, not just sub-Saharan Africa, but if your party isn't getting the votes that you think it should get, and your perception is wrong, right, because assuming that we don't have, in a lot of these cases, widespread fraud, when we're talking about states, elections don't have widespread fraud, and people still don't accept the results. The reason why they don't is that self-selection bubble. Again, their perception is there's no way we could have lost. Everyone I talked to is in support of this candidate. How could that candidate have lost? And so perception really reinforces the behavior of these young groups, of these elites, right? And the elites buy into that and they get people who support them to become violent actors. And so perception really plays a role here, and so we can't ignore it, right? That's why we have to talk about the subjective ontology of, right, how people see the world, the intersubjective ontology of how we share values and meaning and things, and then objective ontology, right? Vote is objective, right? We can count the votes, right? So that's an objective ontology, but even though we can count the votes doesn't mean that the people who are involved in the election will accept the vote count, right? Even if we can prove beyond any doubt that the votes were fair and not manipulated, you're still going to have people who don't accept it, not because they feel like the evidence is in line with fraudulent, but because they didn't get the outcome they expected. And this happens quite a bit, right? I didn't get the outcome I expected. I must have been cheated, right? And gamblers feel that they're being cheated by slot machines, right? That people involved in the election feel like they're being cheated through some organization that's trying to change the outcome. So this is a perception-based thing, and it really matters to understand people's perception because it will inform their behavior moving forward. Okay, so this is going to get uploaded. I will set an announcement. Thank you for watching.